All right, welcome out this week to A Case for America. I am Austin Hepworth, an attorney, and we're here with Michael Hepworth, a numbers database guy. And we are here to talk about something we love, which is America, and to talk about some issues associated with helping America be at this balance point. As we've stated in a number of our episodes, we strongly believe that America is amazing because it tries to strike this balance between anarchy and tyranny, the balance between the individual and the community, a balance that we believe when it's at the balance point, that's liberty or freedom. We feel strongly that freedom and liberty is an actual state of existence created by law, but that there's enough balance in place to ensure that there's still individual decision available to people, but there are some laws in place to enable and create a scenario where individuals can function in a forum, in a community where they can work together. And we feel that laws are necessary to establish a state of freedom, but that if they go too far, it throws that off. But that at this balance point, the country thrives. And so we want to focus today on freedom of speech. Some people believe that the freedom of speech means they can say whatever they want. We don't necessarily believe this is the case. We don't believe that freedom of speech, if you look at that as a phrase together, is something that exists together. We don't believe that means you can say whatever you want, because that would be similar to anarchy. There'd be no freedom that exists in an anarchy type state. And the First Amendment to the Constitution states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I believe that if Congress, or if the founders wanted to ban, if they wanted to ban the government from having any power to regulate any form of speech, they would have just said, Congress shall make no law abridging speech. But they said specifically the freedom of speech. They knew that some laws were necessary, in my opinion. And they were saying that we shouldn't be attacking the circle or the center, the balance point where freedom exists. If we can get speech to this place where there is appropriate balances in place, that they felt the best exchange of ideas would occur, and that the most truth would be pursued and sought after. And so when we look at freedom of speech, and I guess even look at the word abridge, what that means, Merriam-Webster Dictionary says that the word abridge means to diminish or reduce in scope. And so if we're not supposed to diminish or reduce in scope the freedom of speech, it's inferring that freedom of speech has bounds somewhere. It has a playing field. It has something that exists where we are allowed to talk and say things and exchange ideas, but there's still bounds to it. Because without those bounds, again, we'd be in this anarchy type position in place. And so with this, it's interesting to look at some examples like Facebook. Facebook, under our laws, is considered a private platform. It's not government run. And Facebook, in order to be successful, to create a forum where people engage in speech, made some basic rules. And part of those, for example, is Facebook said, we don't allow pornography on our site. And users can flag content. It can be removed and pulled down. And very few people have issues with that. And honestly, if Facebook didn't have those restrictions in place and those regulations, it would probably never become the forum that it is today. But because it has become successful, and a lot of Americans use Facebook, Facebook comes under attack of when it decides to moderate content or remove certain content, because generally someone is upset by the fact that they've chosen to remove content. Again, not as much on the pornographic side. I haven't really heard any rumblings of someone upset that they removed pornography from their site. But they know that in order to create an environment where people will interact together, where people will come back to and engage in this town hall type feeling, it was necessary to have some regulation in place about what could or couldn't be shared. And so with that, one of the questions naturally arises as we talk about freedom of speech and what the balance is as to the question of what is speech. And this is a question that has plagued courts and judges and others for quite some time, because what was intended when they said freedom of speech? What were they talking about? Were the founders talking about freedom to post pornography wherever you want? Freedom to threaten to kill someone. What exactly were they talking about? And Michael, I know you've looked at some historical records and what some people feel, and what are some of the thoughts that people have on what was meant by speech?
It's become a bigger issue today, but used to be speech was whatever you're saying, whatever you're printing, written word. It's largely become now down to expression. People will say drug use is a freedom of speech. So they have a freedom to express and to use drugs, any drug they want. Pornography, as you mentioned. The clothes you wear. There's when institutions try to institute dress codes or something like that, there's usually somebody who says this is a restriction of freedom of speech because they have the right to wear whatever they want. I know there's usually, I can't speak for every city, but from what I know, there's exposure laws about what people can, how much of your body must be covered when you're out in public. And some people feel that that's a restriction on speech and its freedom. People generally feel that whatever, if they want to be able to say it or do it involving their own personal self, they kind of look at that as speech. In that, if they can't like feel a direct impact on somebody else, I mean, they're not punching somebody else in the face, then they usually define that as speech. This is a speech. This is the way I feel, so I should be able to express myself in this way. And so when people want to do things that kind of push the boundaries of either cultural acceptance or even legal acceptance, they like to use freedom of speech as the method to do so. Hey, I want to do this thing. People think it's inappropriate, but I have freedom of speech, so I can do it.
And I would suggest, even in recent years, we've seen a societal push from some, or a push in society, maybe is the better way to say this, to characterize even riots, destruction of property,
Right.
and other things of speech to say, oh, we don't agree with what took place, so we're going to go destroy a police car, or we're going to go paint city signs and streets red, or we're going to burn down some buildings, as an expression or a communication of our disagreement with things. And so if we look at speech in that realm, if that truly is speech, it's a form of communication, right? We've communicated our anger. Punch someone in the face, or burn down their building, or paint their street red, whatever it is. We've communicated something very clearly. So in a sense, we've spoken. But where would we be in society if we could all speak that way? If there was no laws against destroying someone's property because we were speaking, it's just taking us quickly back to a place of anarchy. And this is why I think we both feel that freedom of speech means we're talking about a scenario where laws do exist, and where laws have identified there's actually some type of speech that's so harmful and bad it destroys the very fabric of society.
I think to take a very simple example is anytime a group is gathered together, or you could look at any government for that matter, and they need input, or they need to pass, talk about some sort of business. Typically, there's a set of rules to define how they're going to discuss that. This particular individual will lead the discussion. There will be this amount of time set aside for comments. This is how people will vote. If everybody got together, if you had 100 people who got together in a room, they need to discuss something, and it was, hey, I have freedom of speech, I need to be heard, and everybody just yelled, then nobody's heard, and there's no freedom at that point. It's absolute anarchy. It's just chaos. And so I think people understand this at a very simple level. Hey, if I'm going to get together with a group of people, we have to kind of set rules for engagement. And you can look at those rules as laws in a sense, that in order for this to actually work, or for there not to be anarchy, there have to be some rules in place. And that may be too simple in that it's like, well, these are laws for processing. Like, why do we drive on the left side of the road or on the right side of the road? But there's a moral basis to that, where we feel that it's important that the concerned parties are heard, and to make them heard, the moral thing to do is to put in laws so that they can be heard, and so it's not just anarchy.
Yeah, and that, from my perspective, creates more freedom. It creates a scenario where it pulls us out of that anarchy, like you talked about. We're just yelling, screaming at each other, destroying each other's cars or seats or whatever it is we're smashing, to a place where we can show up, we can exchange ideas, we can have this free flow of information. And from what I understand of the founders, one of the biggest things they were concerned about was the ability for America to have a place to exchange ideas, to flesh things out, to look through things, to talk about things. And certainly in that, I think that they were very much, I'd say, almost in agreement that we had to tolerate ideas we didn't agree with, because the best way to stop the proliferation of bad ideas is to share more good ideas, to respond to untruths with more truth. But certainly that breaks down. That's not always possible in a lot of transactions. So as we look at speech, and we look at freedom of speech, if we go to the business world, we see things like a salesman selling a used car. They tell you, oh yeah, it's great, no known problems. We did our full 50-point inspection, all these kinds of things. But let's say that they didn't do the inspection, and they actually knew that the car had come from hurricane, whatever, where it was underwater for 2 weeks or whatnot. And they don't disclose that to you. You buy the car, and then within 2-3 days, it's not working anymore. This isn't a situation where once you've exchanged money, you can just go back and say, hey, you lied to me. I'm going to share some truth with you and give me back my money. And I think most of America very strongly feels that laws against fraud are appropriate. Fraud's an absolute form of speech. You've communicated something, you've shared something, but you don't have the right to profit off of a lie, to take advantage of somebody, because there really isn't a good way for TruthSlayer to correct that issue for that person. And so the law steps in and says, if we're going to have any semblance of society, if we're going to have any semblance of existence, we can't allow each other to take advantage of the other and make money off them, to exchange things that we know are false and wrong and inaccurate. So America currently has quite a few laws against fraud that go pretty far into regulating what can or can't be said. And some of those laws may get a little bit may go too far and throw things off balance some. For example, if you go to invest in a company, and you ever look through their disclosures that are required by law so that they're not considered fraudulent, there are so many hundreds of pages of disclosures that they become meaningless. We've now mandated that we disclose everything from the moon, to the moon and back, about what might influence someone's decision to invest. And it makes it so that that information is virtually meaningless to an individual. They can't digest the hundreds of pages. They can't look it through. And it's kind of death by disclosure, where now, oh, I disclosed it to you. See, it's in writing. So yeah, I told you it was a great investment, but then I told you in writing that there's these other factors, but there was hundreds of pages of them. You didn't look through every one of them. So it creates an interesting thing, and I don't believe that we're currently in balance as it relates to corporate investing necessarily. But just it's the point that the law is so strongly recognized in the law that we can ban fraud, that the courts have allowed incredible amounts of regulations to come into play on the corporate side of things.
And I think that's an important point. We discussed at the beginning how the freedom of speech is used as almost an excuse sometimes. Hey, I can go destroy this business because I'm angry. But on the fraud side, we're, lying as a corporation really has been looked dimly upon in America for a long time, and there's a lot of heavy restrictions on that. And so there's two very distinct pressures, I think, right now. There's some areas that we're really clamping down on what people can and can't say. And then there's other pressures to, hey, this thing over here that I really want to do is free speech. You should let me do it. And I'm not sure where each pressure is coming from. It seems from all over the place, but there's two very distinct pressures. And that's probably a lot of what we see today in the conflict. You get these two sides just pushing against each other. And sometimes the two sides flip and they don't even know. They want freedom over here, but they don't want freedom over here. And they want to pick and choose where they can have their freedom of speech, where they can't. It just creates a lot of conflict, I think, because as we're trying to nail down what's the principle of free speech, where does that balance lie, so that we're not suffering between these two pressures.
Yeah, and it's something that it's always interesting to me to talk to someone about their actual political principles, because they often talk about conclusions they want or results they want, but they don't realize they're in violation of their own political principles. And speech is such a fascinating thing because every one of us can find speech we find very damaging or we feel is very harmful. And we may even be completely accurate that it's super harmful. But not even if something's super harmful, it doesn't necessarily justify government involvement to ban it immediately. I think there needs to be a deeper consideration about, is this something that can exist even if it's harmful in the realm, this freedom of speech realm that we create, and can truth correct it over time if the process plays out? Or is it something like fraud that in general you don't have a correction for in this sphere? Once I've traded money and I say, oh sweet, I'll give you money, you give me the car, there's not a good fix. It's not something that gets fixed over time. And there's a significant harm, direct, immediate harm to somebody that, again, in order for society to exist, we have to curtail somewhat and push back on. But to your point, corporations become very good about defrauding people. And one way they do it currently, I believe, is through actually following the law. We pass so many laws and regulations now. If we go back to our balance here on the fraud side of things, if we look at this, tyranny exists where laws actually start to hurt us. And the reason I think laws are hurting us right now in the corporate investing side of things is because if the corporation has disclosed something in writing to you, you can't seek relief against them because they told you in writing. But now their writings are hundreds of pages long, full of legalese. It makes no sense to the average person. And very few people have the money to pay an attorney to go through all of it and look at their situation and advise them appropriately on every risk factor disclosed and everything like that disclosed. And companies can hide all kinds of things in their hundreds of pages of documents. And then they just have to point it out to a judge. And they get off, they can do quite a few nefarious things, but get away with a lot of it because they disclose it. And I've seen that time and time again as an attorney, that someone can be promised something. You can have your door-to-door salesman that comes to your house, promises you the moon, and then he has you sign an agreement, but the agreement says something slightly different. And it says at the end, and you agree that this written document contains all the promises we made to you. Well, great. They say that in there, but I didn't draft this. I didn't sit down with the document and go through it. And when the laws say, oh, it was written, and we actually require they disclose these things, when there gets to be too much disclosure, this balance starts to be thrown off. And so I think to your point about these competing interests that come in, I believe that the competing forces start to come into play because in America, people, I feel, are inherently good. I believe the majority of America is still really good people. And I believe that innately, when we sense a harm, we sense something bad that's happened, we want to fix it. We want to correct it. We want to make sure this harm doesn't continue to happen. And when our laws get out of balance, there are harms that happen where people don't have great redress. We start to sense that corporations are playing us and taking advantage of us. So we ask for more laws, but the more laws that are passed, the more they can actually really stick it to us, and we have very little remedy left. On the flip side, we look at harm. We know, for example, that pornography is very harmful to minors and to adults. There's studies now showing that pornography changes the physical wiring in brains. It acts like a stimulant. It's crazy addictive. And there's intense harm. You can talk to person after person whose life has been destroyed by pornography. Marriage is destroyed, families destroyed. And we similarly say, oh, there's something bad happening here. We want to do something about it. And so I think that one of the things that drives these competing pressures in society are often just simply that there's harms on both sides. And as people are naturally good, they want to do something about it. And a big part of the Case for America, I think, and what we're trying to do here is to articulate that while I believe very strongly it's good to seek solutions to problems, and we should be very proactive about that, some of those solutions lie with us as people and things that we need to do. And if we ask the government to create the solution for everything, it throws off the balance. And that creates more and more problems. It gets to be worse and worse. And so we have to understand when we ask the government to be involved and where, and when we know private solutions are necessary, when we need to step up. And Mike, you're on mute.
That's a really good point, because you point to the way the law has come down hard on corporations and fraud, and how it's kind of just backfired, unintended consequences, I guess, that no individual is going to read all those pages of disclosures. And I don't think we have the conversation enough in our political discussions about what the law is able and capable of doing. We look to the law as though if we were just to write something up, we could fix it, whatever the problem is. Forgetting that problems are complex, solutions are complex, humans are humans. We make mistakes. We can't see all, even with our amazing technology, we still have all kinds of issues. And we don't seem to have the political discussions around, is this something the law can fix, or is this something the law should fix? We just say there's a problem, the law should fix it. You talked about harm, which I think is a great point to bring up, because that's always brought up in freedom of speech discussions. People feel you shouldn't be able to harm other people. They point to physical harm, how we all seem to agree that we legally shouldn't be able to physically harm one another. And so they try to take that out in speech, where something you say may harm somebody. But then we realize that harm isn't easily defined. If you're not allowed to harm somebody, is a doctor not allowed to cut someone open? Because that's harming them. And we say, well, the outcome is better. And generally, you could argue that it is. Sometimes it isn't. So harm is a really interesting thing to try to define when it comes down to this. We don't have this discussion. Can the government fix this? Is this something the government should fix? Or, to your point, maybe we as a people need to step up and take pride in being Americans and pursue individual solutions, things that we can do where we don't need the heavy hand of government getting involved.
Yeah. And it is interesting to look at the harm scenario, because this is this ties a lot into even looking at what speech is. We know, for example, it can be hurtful if I call you, Michael, a name. I just, say some epithet or whatever at you. Sometimes we as people can have thick enough skin that it just rolls off and we keep moving. Sometimes it really impacts us. Sometimes it depends on the day. Sometimes it depends on the person saying it. But speech can, because speech has the power to uplift and inspire, it has the power to hurt, to pull people down, to do different things. And there are people that will use it to hurt and pull people down. But if we pass laws that stop all hurt and all forms of hurt with speech, we are in essence stopping the ability for it to uplift as well. Because naturally, if we're going to uplift someone or share a positive thing, someone else may be able to take offense at it. And so it is something we have to be super cautious about, to say, if we are asking to regulate certain things, I believe that when we look at regulation, if we say, okay, we want to stop this, the bad, we need to always ask, well, what's the good that it may stop as well? What's the good that can come from this? And I'm very interested right now because actually I can wait a second. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just going to make a quick comment about that exact thing. In order to, if you think of somebody who's capable of helping somebody else, they're also capable of hurting them. You're not in this circumstance to be able to help somebody unless you have some sort of ability, or even to use the word power, to lift somebody or to help somebody in their situation. But that means you have the ability to harm as well. So if you think of binding somebody's hands so they can't hurt somebody, you're also binding them so they can't help somebody. And so, to your point, the law is going to restrict many things. It's going to restrict the activity you don't like. It's also going to restrict maybe activities you do like, and we should be conscious of that.
Yeah, and it's one that I've been interested with because currently there's a few states in America looking to change a few regulations on the practice of law. And attorneys traditionally are under some fairly strict ethical rules about what they can or can't do, things they can or can't say. And with some of the changes, some people have concerns. They say, well, what happens when we allow some of these changes in place, and what if we get an Amazon legal and it just, a company the size of Amazon takes over the practice of law and it grows into a huge corporate client? Currently, most law firms, very few law firms have over 1,000 attorneys in them. Most are smaller, kind of local, couple person shops type things. And people are concerned about this. Well, in my discussions on these issues, I say, well, currently, at least in Utah, I think something like at least 70, 80% of people that go into court are unrepresented by an attorney. They can't afford it. And they don't have access to legal help, legal services. They're making poor decisions. Many don't even make it into court. And I look at it and go, Amazon was an amazing company in the sense that it brought the world to people's doorsteps, literally. They'll deliver anything around the world almost to your doorstep, and at a pretty good price for the most part. They've done just an amazing job of that. Now, we may be mad at Amazon for a whole host of reasons, but it's hard to argue that they have helped make Americans incredibly rich and have access to an incredible number of products. So currently we have a scenario where people say, well, I want to ban the harm that may come from an Amazon controlling the practice of law, which there could be harm from that. I'm not saying there may not be, but currently, if Amazon takes over law and makes it so the law is delivered to every individual's doorstep, it's packaged in a way they can understand, they can make good decisions, they can get relief, they can do the things they need, then is that a better worst case scenario than where we're at, where 70, 80% of Utah, and I'm sure it's similar in other states, don't have access to the law. They don't have access to attorneys. And I sit here and go, why are we so concerned about what might happen with an Amazon when there's 70-80% of the population completely cut out from accessing the law. And it's this point about when we choose to regulate to protect, even to protect in quotes, we are cutting off other forms of innovation. And currently the law has been incredibly stagnant as an industry. You know, it took a very long time for the law to adopt even e-filing. There's still courts around the nation that still have a stenographer sitting in the courtroom typing shorthand to everything that's said and recording it with a human, as opposed to just having microphones for everybody and making an audio recording of it. The law has been so slow to embrace technology, to catch up with it, to utilize it. And a lot of the rules have restricted that, so that, again, it's under this pretense that we're protecting America by making sure that only licensed attorneys do things and there's no capitalist people or whatever involved, even though that's its own issue, because attorneys are capitalist as well and want to earn money. But we trade one harm for another harm. And I don't believe that the regulations on the practice of law are balanced at all. And I believe that when they're off like they are, it creates a serious problem in America where most Americans don't have access to the law, don't have access to courts because of all that's in place with it. And so we have these situations, again, with speech. We look at harm. And an example that's currently playing out in society is with school libraries. So with the gender ideology movements taking place, some people feel it's very necessary to have books in the school libraries to help children understand if they're a girl or a boy, or to go through gay relationships or queer relationships or whatever it is that they feel is necessary to help children with. And other people view this as a form of intense danger to children, especially when it comes down to some of these books contain very graphic descriptions of sex scenes. And to some people, it's very pornographic. To others, they say, well, this is nothing compared to what's available online. But to many, they feel that children can become addicted to pornography based on what they read in the school library. And they say, why should a school have stimulants in it? And others say, you're just trying to, ban ideologies that you don't like or support. And that's not appropriate either. And so America is kind of caught in this interesting battle right now where school libraries are in the crossfire a lot for books they do or don't have. And it's interesting that we focus so much on gender ideology and sexually explicit books when school libraries are a finite space. Whether a school library picks up a book or not doesn't result in a ban on that book. It doesn't result in parents not being able to share that book with their children. It just means we have finite space here. And what should guide a school library? Should a school library be able to say, we're only going to have books about white children in here. We're not going to have a single book that includes a black character. That would probably be wrong for a school library to make that type of decision. But on the flip side, can we expect that a school library completely adheres to our views, has no books that we disagree with? And even if we acknowledge that there has to be some in there that we disagree with, to what extent can they be pornographic? Can they have Playboy magazine in there? Should they? And I would submit this is another aspect of speech that America has struggled talking about and addressing, is that currently the courts say that pornography is a form of speech because they view it as a form of expression. And so the government has issues constitutionally. They're not allowed to ban a lot of pornography. And there's certainly a push for many parents that want to protect their children, understandably, from getting addicted to pornography, to remove pornography from places, to seek to ban it. And there's a pushback to say, no, if you start to allow them to ban pornography, then what else are you giving the government a license to do? And again, as we've talked about, that's an appropriate question to ask, because if we take away one thing, we could be taking away something else that we value. My personal belief with something like pornography is that pornography is far more a stimulant than speech. I view it far more similar to fraud. It's a lie. It tricks you. It gets you addicted. It does certain things that destroy relationships. They destroy even the freedom to get together and have discussions. If I were to go to a debate and people showed up engaged in sexual acts or nude or whatever, it would completely destroy the ability to function in that realm of speech. We wouldn't be able to exchange ideas and do things because of the nature of what was created there. And so that's something that, to me, and even looking at Facebook knows it can't function if it allows pornography on its site. There's something about pornography that destroys the public sphere and the public place and the element of speech associated.
And I think at a very basic level, I've used this example before. People kind of understand this concept. This is maybe along the lines of what you wear, but if you imagine you're taking your kindergartner to meet their teacher for the first time, and the teacher was there, male or female, just not wearing any clothes, would you feel comfortable with your child in that class, or would you say maybe there should be some sort of standard where this isn't appropriate? And the teacher says, well, I have freedom of speech. I can wear whatever I want. And so the question comes down to, is what you wear really speech, or is it something more than that? Are we regulating it the same way, or as you say, is it more of a stimulant when it comes to pornography? And I think at the extremes, we can see that. It's just interesting when we always go to the edge cases. Well, this is kind of like this other thing that we allowed, and it seems like we just haven't come down up with good principles behind what is speech, what is not speech.
Yeah, and I think we are, so far the principle seems to just be that we communicated something, but that opens it up to this whole big thing, because again, the founders didn't say freedom of communication. They didn't say freedom of expression. And speech, I think, is more limited than any communication. I think it's more limited than any expression. And again, I do believe that as we look at society and say what balance is necessary, I think for humans to be able to interact in a public space, schoolroom, business, there has to be standards about dress. There just does. We all as humans have an animal side to us, in that certain things will stimulate or cause us to think or act in certain ways. And we can't pretend like we can just all associate together and have no repercussions for that in any way, without clothes or whatever else. And when we create certain standards and put certain things in place, it does allow for people to have the ability to interact at a higher level, to entertain deeper thought, to get to deeper places. And it's interesting to look at even kind of standards of speech based on decorum. If you walk into a courtroom as a judge or an attorney, you can't be there unless you're dressed essentially as professional as society lets you dress, because you have a very high standard. You're involved in a very strong exchange of ideas, an intense battle between competing ideas, and you're expected and required to follow intense rules of decorum associated with that, because anything else detracts from this search for truth in that realm. And rules of court have never, to my knowledge, been held to really restrict freedom of speech of somebody. And this is something that the courts have pretty consistently held, as they've said, well, you may have the freedom of speech, but again, on this balance, as we look at how these balance in America, does that mean that you can play your radio as loud as you want at 12 p.m.? No, because the government can impose, they say, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. You can't just get on a loudspeaker and blast your whole neighborhood and say, well, I have the freedom to do whatever I want with speech, so you just got to listen. The government can restrict where and how. This is even something with property. I know a number of libertarians believe that there should be no restrictions on what you do with your own property. But if I put up a billboard on my property next to the freeway and it involves a nude person, does society really not have any right or ability to say, no, we're not okay with that? We're not okay. We do have some basic standards of decency in our society. We are going to expect you to wear clothing. And we are going to expect that you don't just put this stuff up and out there, because there is something happening that starts to erode the ability of people to exchange ideas, to seek for truth. And America is currently grappling with that, where we've really focused in on it with things like hate speech, with conduct on school campuses, college campuses that may dissuade people from joining a conversation. Bullying is a huge thing. Do I have the right to threaten to harm somebody? Do I have the right to put up a sign that says, I'll kill you? To what extent do we need to curtail certain threats in order to have freedom? Meaning the sphere where, again, a community can function together, people can come into it, speak their mind. Now, does that mean that the government has to make it so there's no repercussions for you speaking your mind, or there's no fear of you getting in that public space and speaking your mind? No, that's not possible. Law can't remove fear from someone. They can't remove social pressure. They can't remove a bunch of things. And so then the question becomes, what can law do? And can it set these, appropriate boundaries to create this arena of speech?
And I think that's the important point here is we're not just saying, let's make a law so we can fix, like you talk about the decorum in a courtroom. There's rules there and regulations to follow. We're not saying, hey, the government now needs to create rules of decorum for society. If you think back 100, 150 years, the civility in society has changed a lot. What's considered appropriate on TV or in movies compared to what it used to be? What's considered appropriate interactions with individuals in a store, on the freeway? What used to be said and what is said today, our civility towards each other has changed a lot. And part of the pressure around freedom of speech is we've noticed as civility degrades between humans, harm rises. I think we can feel that. And so a lot of people look towards the government to step in and say, well, let's reduce a lot of this harm. Our civility is just degraded to the point where the government needs to come in and make some laws. And the question is, what is the proper balance? What is the responsibility that we as citizens need to stand up and take? Because again, we talked about the balancing powers in the American government and why it's been so great. Part of that was that the people held such a large balance of the power and responsibility. There's a lot of civility, a lot of self-regulation. And as we lose that in society, then the pressure shifts more towards the government to come in with its heavy hand and say, all right, I'm going to help you with your inability to control yourself. Because if, left to yourselves, you guys are just going nuts. And maybe we should look at ourselves and say, what can we do to increase civility around us? And maybe that is one of the methods to reestablish the true freedom of speech.
Yeah, I completely agree. If we look at things like Facebook, they're under intense pressure, Facebook, Twitter, others. Because one, people want them to remove all violent content. They want them to remove threats. They want them to remove things that promote violence or incite people to violence. People want them to remove misinformation. They say, hey, if something's knowingly false, take it off your site. They want them to remove copyrighted works. If someone posts Disney's Frozen on there and say, hey, come watch it here for free, I'll create my own version of Disney and I'll just upload videos, come stream it for free. Should a social media site have to take that down if they receive notice of it? Because if not, then anyone can just post from outside the country and completely circumvent all of America's copyright laws, all these other things. And so we're in this funny scenario where there's a number of competing forces where we're saying, ooh, we don't like that someone is sharing something violent. But then we also don't like that Facebook's algorithms continue to spread that violent content simply because people click on it or like it or celebrate it. And so now is Facebook making money off of spreading violent content simply because it creates ad views or whatnot? And so we have this very funny tension. But again, going back to, but Facebook bans pornography. Facebook, can they ban things that are anti-Facebook? People that suggest that Facebook should go down the drain or something. They're not the government, so they're not regulated by the First Amendment. But even in just looking at what it takes to have good speech, I've been interested in watching Twitter with Twitter's experiments with the change of rules. So Elon Musk buys Twitter, takes it from a public company to a private company, and they start implementing all kinds of new rules. And Twitter, I don't know what to believe or not. I read different reports. Some indicate Twitter's doing really good. Others indicate that it's on the brink of falling apart kind of thing because there's a change in culture, a change in what's taking place. I'm not a Twitter user myself. But when I look at that, I say, so yeah, what is the responsibility here? If Russia comes to Twitter and says, hey, we'd like to pay you money, we'll pay you a lot of money, and we're going to post inaccurate information about American elections to try and influence American elections. Does the government have an interest in saying, no, Twitter, Facebook, you can't take money from Russians because this is American elections, they're spreading lies. What if it's an American that's spreading lies? It's not Russia. Again, what happens? Can I take money to knowingly spread a lie? What if I think it might be true? I don't know for sure. I haven't paid someone to research it. And we get into these realms of speech where there's very difficult questions that come up. Because if Facebook is responsible for violent content, then we're going to lose a lot of content that we may feel is appropriate. Because if they're going to get sued and held responsible for it, they're going to err on the side of caution, generally. But if they're not held responsible and their algorithms continue to share violent content and perpetuate it, then on the flip side, what starts to happen? Do we start to reshape America through AI or whatnot, promoting certain things that create revenue and money? And how do we create this balance? And this is an aspect that I don't believe we have the full answer for currently in America. We're wrestling with competing ideas, competing tensions. But I believe if we turn to the government for all these solutions, we're missing the mark. And to your point, Michael, we have to look inward and say, what's my responsibility? What's the government's responsibility in shaping some of these things as it relates to Russia or China paying money to place all kinds of content, have it spread that may be false or misleading? Maybe it's accurate. Do we want Russia paying to promote certain ideologies? I don't know. This gets interesting if they're a stated enemy of the United States. North Korea, I think, just announced they're going to obliterate the U.S.
Well, and what does it mean for Russia to get involved? Is it the government of Russia? Is it a Russian individual? Is it Russia funding money to a company in America that's then posting the ads? Like, it's a difficult question.
Yeah, it is. And again, if you're in this spot of responsibility of these companies, you're going, wow, how do we vet all this out? How do we understand what's taking place, what's going on? Because right now, I know on Facebook, prior to the Russia alleged involvement in elections, you could post political ad very simply. They just take your money, you post it, you run it. Now, if you want to post a political ad, you have to go through a pretty intense screening procedure. have a law in place, verify compliance with a bunch of laws and different things. And it makes it so that average citizens like you and I have a very hard time posting political ads on Facebook. So because we're trying to stop a harm of Russia coming in and Facebook has to clamp down, it's shutting out the ability it's making it more difficult for little people to make it through, to talk about things, to do things, and to pay for an ad to run, about their candidate or whatnot. And so we always have these interesting things as the law seeks to attack harm. We have to look at, well, now we're shutting out average citizens too. Is that what we want? Is there a better way to approach this? Is there a better balance, check and balance in place where maybe a law is necessary, but maybe some self-restraint is necessary too? Maybe as people, we stop clicking on ads or sites that don't verify who they're funded by. I've always wondered about that. I thought, why do we even, as a society, tolerate quoting studies that don't disclose who their funders were? I'm not even talking about a law, just why in academics, why in my life, why do I ever rely on a study that just a study doesn't disclose who funded it, doesn't disclose who did it, doesn't give its data for me to review? I think, why can't we as Americans just have this simple solution that says, if you're not going to disclose stuff, we just won't rely on you. Just move on. We're not going to quote you. We're not going to cite you. And even if someone cites them, trying to convince us to do something, we say, I'm not going to believe it till you give full transparency on this.
It's very much a cultural thing. We're kind of building this in America. We don't move fast enough. If we're going to say, how about we wait a second and get some more data? It's just not fast enough for us today. And so to your point, if it's a cultural thing we've built up, is it a cultural thing that we can change and say, maybe we need to slow down a little bit and see if we can find better answers?
Yeah, and even just from the perspective of, but can the law change it? Can the law say, oh, you can only quote something that is transparent? Well, now are we going to put individuals in jail for quoting a study because they didn't understand the law or whatever that existed?
Right.
And this is just a place where I think, instead of turning to the law for help with misinformation, I look as I Google something on the internet, and the site names that come up, it's amazing to me to look at, go, I've never heard of this site before. They're here telling me something that exists. Why do I believe it? And this is something where I don't know that there's been a resolution to this yet, but and maybe there has been. But recently, an attorney in New York in a big case, a big law firm, supposed to be super advanced attorney, was looking for some cases that supported their position, and they were asking ChatGPT for cases. And ChatGPT spit out some cases, spit out some summaries with it. They were right on point. This attorney was stoked, throws them into his brief, submits it to the court, and the other side, and when reviewing the brief, try to pull up the cases and realize these cases don't exist. They don't appear in any database anywhere. And so they file a motion with the court saying, hey, we think this attorney submitted some false cases. And the attorney looks into it and realizes that ChatGPT just made up these cases. They weren't real cases. Now, in that scenario, some people may say we need more laws. But I look at that and say, why don't we just say you should exercise self-restraint? And maybe that attorney should be sanctioned individually for what they did. But do we really need more laws? Because that is something we can verify that so easily. If ChatGPT spits out a case, take a minute and verify it. And to your point, we're so used to just looking for answers, we don't go to verify them. And I've seen that over and over again where people will say, oh, I read this online. And I just go, look, I just did a simple Google search just to verify and found 5 things that were opposite that. I've seen this with political claims quite a bit. I saw it a lot during COVID, where people would write me and say, hey, Austin, this guy just figured out the secret bullet to shut down all COVID laws or whatever, people that wanted to push back against COVID restrictions. And I'd go and look, and they'd say that somebody subpoenaed certain information, and because the information didn't exist, they dismissed all charges or whatnot, or dropped out COVID regulations. And so I just Google and just say, hey, this case, this scenario. And sure enough, there was one where someone had sent a subpoena in a case to the Department of Health or something, looking for some information. They were responded to and said, yeah, we don't have this info. But at the same time, the jurisdiction they were in had met their vaccination quota. And they had said a long time ago, even before this case, if we get this % of the population vaccinated, we'll drop a lot of our COVID restrictions. And you could read that in a lot of different sources, liberal, conservative, all over. And so the subpoena comes back about the same time that the vaccination rate meets this quota, and the city celebrates and says, oh, we're going to drop our stuff now. And sources then said, oh, because he subpoenaed certain information, they had to drop all restrictions. It just wasn't true. It wasn't even remotely true, but it was unreal how many people bought it up because it sounded good, it sounded great. And they didn't even take it literally took 5 seconds just to type it in and Google it and see that there was a whole host of other reasons associated with what took place. And we then say, well, we want the government to step in or Facebook to step in on misinformation. And I say, where's personal responsibility in that? You have the world at your fingertips. Why can't you take a minute to verify and take a second to step back and do that? And so that is, again, to us, part of this balance. Freedom can exist in a scenario where we want the government to fix everything. But it also can't exist in a scenario where we want no law or restriction. And speech is one of those things that we need to really come down and do an intense look at to say, to what extent should someone be able to call somebody else a name? Because if we ban all name calling, what's the good that's being banned too? Can I then, if name calling is not allowed, can I say that someone's virtuous? Or have I just called everyone else non-virtuous? What starts to happen in those scenarios? Because that happens all the time on social media right now. If you say, oh, this person's a hero, instantly people pop in, what about all these people? And just by asserting something good about someone, it's now implied you're inserting something bad about other people. And so name calling, bullying, yes, we certainly don't want kids getting beat up on the playground. I'm not advocating for that. But there are scenarios, even within the freedom of speech, it's fascinating to watch. There's a person that worked at a school district in custodial, or not custodial, but grounds crew. And he managed crews and different things. And there were some people that refused to work that he was over. And so as a manager, he had a meeting with them, told them they needed to change, they refused to change, continued to have meetings. And at some point, he got decently frustrated and said, hey, look, if you don't want to work here, there's the door, free to leave. The employee went and reported him for bullying, saying that she felt threatened by her job. Her job she was threatened that she might lose her job. The school district had a 0 tolerance for bullying, and they wrote up the manager and said, yep, you bullied. You can't do things like that. You can't make people feel in fear of losing their job. And that may seem like an extreme example, and it is a little extreme. But with a lot of the 0 tolerance for bullying and these other things that we're doing to protect kids, we are creating these very interesting scenarios where we can't say anything. Sometimes people probably should feel uncomfortable. Probably should feel that something's on the line if they don't shape up or do certain things. And just a full-on out ban on all bullying is going to not balance things correctly, where we have to tolerate some levels of discomfort and harm as a society. We have to tolerate ideas we don't like. And that's a balance we need to consistently look for of, whoa, this is going a little too far, too much regulation. It's harming us, actually. It's creating scenarios that are shutting things down. It's making people afraid to talk and share things. And so with where we're at in speech, the invitation to you this week is to think about your views on speech and to think about the principles that are necessary for there to be a healthy ability to share ideas in society. What allows you to freely share ideas? What stops that from happening? When is law necessary? When is your individual restraint, your individual contribution, your individual work necessary to make things happen or properly balance it? And I believe that if we start looking at speech this way, we'll start to better understand the true freedom of speech and to understand that we have to have some rules in place, but they have to be balanced by individual responsibility as well. And so we hope that this is helpful in talking through some of this, but also helpful in understanding that anarchy is not freedom. No rule, no law is not freedom. And freedom is only found in creating an environment where we can come together, have some basic rules of decorum, and and really talk about what's necessary to strike that balance and strike it correctly. So we appreciate you being with us today, and we will plan on meeting again next week to go through more with A Case for America. Thanks so much.